Acts chapter 19. We're ready for verse 21. Just a brief look back at verse 20. In 19, many people had brought their scrolls of sorcery and burned them in public as an act of repentance, turning away from that life, turning to God. And it was no small thing. 50,000 drachmas, which, remember, equaled roughly 50,000 days' wages. A lot of money, in other words. And in verse 21, after all this had happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I had been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. Well, from Ephesus to Jerusalem, going through Macedonia and Achaia, he had people, friends, to visit on the way, but we don't really know if he visited them even, and if he did, what the nature of the visit was. But he did say this interesting thing that once he had been there, I think that is Jerusalem, I must visit Rome also. I see this in two possible ways at least. One, as an expression of Paul's desire. Rome, it was the center of the world in terms of economics and politics and military. It was the federal capital of the Roman Empire. And the saying is true, all roads lead to Rome. It was the Romans who had built the extensive road work within the known world at that time for primarily the reason of transporting their troops to outlying areas and geography away from the capital. And of course, these roads were used by merchants and travelers of all kinds. So this is one of the things that made Rome a dominant world player. Actually, for their time, the dominant world player. It also could be that Paul had a premonition. I think this is less likely, because if he had sensed that God was going to send him to Rome, it had happened before that God had given him either through a dream or a vision or an audible word, instructions, and this is not mentioned here, but it could be that Paul had a premonition that things would happen and he would wind up in Rome. I don't know. Verse 22, he sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia while he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. Now, Timothy we know about. Erastus, I think this is the only time his name comes up in the whole New Testament. But you know what? To be mentioned at all is quite a badge of honor. Well, Paul sent Timothy and Erastus to Macedonia while he stayed in the province of Asia a little while longer. We don't really know what he was doing in the province of Asia. But in verse 23, about that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. Now the way was a euphemism for the church. A silversmith named Demetrius, who had made silver shrines of Artemis. We got to see who Artemis is. He was also called Diana. She was a Roman goddess of fertility. Anyway, Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He was a little bit like the president of a union or something. He called them together, the other craftsmen, along with the workers in related trades, and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus, and in particularly the whole province of, practically the whole province of Asia." He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. This to us is just a statement of truth. Gods made by human hands are no gods at all. In first century Ephesus, gods made by human hands were gods. They considered them deities. Verse 27, "There's danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, and the world will be robbed of her divine majesty." It's a little bit hard for me to make a clean decision about, so was this what Demetrius was saying? Was this a religious issue, or was it an economic issue? I kind of have come down on the side that this was primarily an economic issue, which he pulled the religious issue into to give it even more emotional strength. Well, at any rate, his speech in verse 28, "When they heard this, they were furious and began to shout, 'Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.'" Boy, whatever Demetrius was, he kind of had a knack here. He stirred up here we go, verse 29. "Soon the whole city was in an uproar." So it's kind of like the wave at the football stadium, right? It spread. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus. These were two of Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, which we really hadn't heard about before. And all of them rushed into the theater together. The theater was the largest public gathering space. They rushed into the theater. Verse 30, "Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him." And I think I know why. It would have been suicidal for him to go in. Verse 31, "Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater." Couple of things. We see here that some of the officials of the province were friends of Paul. I don't know whether they were believers, but they were his friends. Paul did have friends in high places. And they begged him, "Don't go to the theater." Verse 32, "The assembly was in confusion." Really, that's kind of the nature of this kind of crowd hysteria. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. Boy, I wouldn't have wanted to be Alexander in front of this hostile and irrational crowd. And not only did they put him up there, they they shouted what they wanted him to do. Okay, he motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. So when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians." Now this was after 2 hours of, it's hard for me to imagine, 2 hours of people shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." I mean, it's just one phrase over and over and over and over and over and over and over for 2 hours. They were worked up. There was so little rationality in this. You could almost say there was no rationality in it. The city clerk quieted them, and he said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven?" Now, archaeological digs have verified. Most scholars, archaeologists and biblical scholars, believe that this was perhaps, most likely, some fallout from a meteor. And as it fell, it struck the ground, and it made an image that I think very roughly looked like to me, it's a grotesque image. It's an obviously female likeness with many breasts. And the Ephesians, ancient Ephesians, we don't even know exactly when it had happened, but it had been, I would say, at least a century, and the worship of this goddess had taken hold and was not just a local issue, but now all of Asia and the Roman world. Verse 36, "Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You've brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there's anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it." After he said this, he dismissed the assembly. It's as though one person with the rational part of their brain engaged and active put a stop to a 2-hour riot. I believe, I think I just think the city clerk, don't even know his name, certainly had enough respect that when he motioned for silence, they finally got silent. Maybe part of it was they were hoarse after 2 hours of shouting. And he presented a very reasonable case. Verse 41, after he had said this, he dismissed the assembly, and evidently they dispersed. At the very least, it's a way interesting narrative. And in terms of application, well, simple one. Your emotions can carry you a long way in the wrong direction. Well, time's up. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.